The opinions expressed in the following video are not in their entirety endorsed by this podcast. They are instead the focus of our discussion today. This is your content warning.
Did you know that the war in Israel was prophesied in the Bible thousands of years ago? I'm about to tell you 3 facts that you may have never heard before, so watch until the end, and this third one may shock you. Fact number 1, the Bible prophesied that Israel would become a nation again. This happened in 1948, fulfilling prophecies from hundreds of years ago. Fact number 2, the Bible said that after Israel became a nation again, they would regain control of Jerusalem. This happened in the Six-Day War of 1967, again fulfilling prophecy. Fact number 3, the Bible says that surrounding Arab nations will attack Israel in the end times. We are seeing increased tensions between Israel and neighboring countries like Iran, fulfilling more end times prophecy right before our eyes. So in summary, Israel becoming a nation, regaining Jerusalem, and increased hostility from surrounding nations were all prophesied in the Bible thousands of years ago. It's crazy to see these prophecies unfolding right now. The Bible is truly the most accurate holy book and foretold events no one could predict. We are living in very significant times, friends.
Good morning, Joshua, or afternoon, I guess. We just barely slipped into the afternoon section of our day, I reckon. But man, I'm excited you're here because we get to talk about probably the least controversial thing in the world right now, don't we?
Oh, would you say maybe the least controversial? Hint of sarcasm.
I mean, as I surely what we're going to talk about can't possibly cause any issues or confusion. It's all got to be just absolutely black and white. And so I'm excited. We rarely get a topic like that, don't we?
Sure. It's so not controversial that our guest just didn't even appear on the news to talk about it. You know, yeah. Why are we even having this conversation? Some might ask.
I don't know. Maybe one of the days we'll actually get on here and we'll talk about something that maybe is a little bit straightforward for everybody. But guys, welcome in. Welcome back to the Content Warning, a Bible Meets Culture podcast. We break down biblical content versus modern theology. As always, I'm Nathan. That's Joshua, wherever he is on your screen. I don't really know where you're going to appear. It's somehow always different. But Joshua, I'll let you introduce our guest today since you are more familiar with him than I.
And be happy to. This is Dr. David Hester. Dr. Hester is a professor at Faulkner University. He teaches I think mostly in the VP Black College of Biblical Studies, but I think teaches also for the Curley Graduate School of Theology, some classes, and also teaches for the Harbinger Institute out of Nashville. And he has a very long day today, so we're very glad that he was willing to meet with us for about an hour to talk about, in all seriousness, a really interesting and I think important topic in our world today. Dr. Hester is the author of several books and is all over social media. He's the Faulkner Lectureship Director. I was down there last week for the lectures and was able to attend that, and it was phenomenally done, as always, and appreciate Faulkner being willing to do that again. So, Dr. Hester, it's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Good to be with you. I'm glad to be able to take some time to be with you. I'd much rather do this in a faculty meeting, but I didn't say that, okay?
Yeah, we won't hold
faculty
you to
later
that
today, so but I'm glad to be able to be with you to talk about some of the things we're going to be discussing. And a little slight correction: I'm not a professor; I'm an associate professor. A little difference. Even though I'm going to be up for that promotion, hopefully at the end of the year. So everything's in place. Hopefully I'll be able to say professor legitimately. And I don't play a doctor on TV. I don't practice medicine, but I do have an advanced degree. So whatever that means to you, that's fine. Just as long as you don't call me late for supper, that's all I ask.
You bet.
Never.
But still, glad to be with you.
Hey, we're super appreciative of you being on today. And Joshua, as you alluded to, we're talking about a really interesting topic and one that, unless you've been living under a rock or you're purposely choosing to ignore it, it's hard to not know what's going on right now on a global scheme over in the Middle East, dealing with Israel and Pakistan. And we want to talk a little bit about that because when things like this happen, inevitably, what the narrative that follows is biblical prophecy, and are these the end times, right? Whatever that means to you, we can define that in a little bit. But it's one of those things that I got to do a panel discussion about this the other day, and it seems like just in my lifetime, which really isn't that long in the scheme of things. This has happened at least 4 or 5 times in my lifetime alone, and we keep predicting that this end of the age is going to come, and yet we're still here, and we're thankful for that, and we don't know when it's going to happen, but let's start with this. I want to ask you guys a question before we get into the actual video, because the video makes really 3 claims about why what's happening now really impacts or is biblical prophecy coming to fulfillment. But I want to get your opinion on this as we kind of start this. Why are we seemingly so unbelievably curious or obsessed even with trying to predict the end of the world? Where does that come from?
I think it's a fear of the unknown. Even our Lord said, "No one knows the day nor the hour, not the angels in heaven." And I think there, the nor the Son is original to the text. That's debated in scholarly circles, but nor the Son, but the Father alone. And the fear of the unknown, and also I think if I can add one more thing to that, is we tend to believe that we have all the answers that we could ever need. And when there is something that is maybe unanswerable, it causes a lot of problems. And it causes a lot of people to write books and make money, just to be completely honest.
I would agree with that. I'm a little bit older than you two guys. I won't say how older. I was born in, but still, in my life, I've seen a lot of this kind of thing that you're talking about, where people try to predict when Jesus is coming, and they try to tie that in the book of Revelation. When I was, the first place I ever preached regularly, not full-time work, but where I preached from Sunday to Sunday, we received a copy of a booklet, and I still have it. I was looking up here to see if I could see it, but I've not seen it where it usually sits. It was a booklet entitled 88 Reasons Why the Rapture Will Take Place in 1988. It was written by a man named Edgar Whisenant, who claimed to be a NASA rocket scientist. He had specified the day in September of 1988 where Jesus was going to come and the rapture, quote unquote, would take place. Well, the day came, the day went, nothing happened. So then he was interviewed by the AP, and they said, well, I got my calculations a little bit off. It'll happen in November. The day came, the day went, nothing happened. And then he wrote another book for the next year that said Jesus could come in 1989, 1990, 91, 92, 93, 94, 95, ... He was trying to cover all of his bases. But he was trying to say that you can predict when Jesus is coming. His words, if I remember correctly, were, we can't know the day or the hour, but we can know the month and the year. Now, that's hermeneutics at its finest. And I say that with all the sarcasm I can muster. But still, seriously, this idea that the rapture is something that will really take place. I mean, Fox News channel has a commercial running now where it's talking about the rapture. I mean, this is a recent commercial that's running. And it's accepted by a lot of people. The Left Behind series by Jerry B. Jenkins and Tim LaHaye. Not the Jerry Jenkins who was a gospel preacher, but the Jerry Jenkins is still here, unfortunately, and is promoting dispensational premillennialism, which is what this is. Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't want to hog the time, but I'll just say this. During World War II, people said that Adolf Hitler was the beast of Revelation. He died of a suicide in his bunker. Then Joseph Stalin was the beast of Revelation because he was the leader of the communist bloc. Then he died. Nikita Khrushchev became the beast. Slamming his shoe on the table, we will bury you. And then he was shoved out by the Kremlin, by the Politburo. Then Henry Kissinger was suggested to be the beast. Richard Nixon was suggested to be the beast. Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, you name it. People have been suggested to be the beast of Revelation, assuming that these things will happen at the end of time. The series of Omen movies, Omen, Omen 2, Omen, the Final Conflict of the 1970s. By the way, side note, I cannot watch Sam Neill in a movie as a hero. When he was in Jurassic Park, all I'm thinking is, this guy was the beast in Final Conflict. Look at the back of his neck. He's got 666. But anyway, I digress. I'm treating y'all like I do my students, by the way. So anyway, it's promoted because it plays well. In my estimation, it fits in with our Hollywood type notion. The Avengers movies, great special effects, on a wide scale. Same thing when you look at Revelation, it plays like a 3D IMAX fantasy movie. I mean, that's the way John writes it. And we're just enamored by all this. It's got to mean the end of time. And it's got to tie in with Israel. But yet, all these conflicts in the Middle East, the 67 war, the 48 war, the 1990 Gulf conflict, and the more recent conflicts that we've had in the Gulf, every time something like that happens, especially now with Israel being attacked by Hamas, the preachers will get on the radio and will say, we are living in the end times. Don't you see this is happening? And every time they're shown to be false, because that's not what the Bible teaches. I have good reasons for supporting Israel's right to exist. Has nothing to do with the Bible. Has everything to do with geopolitics and the way it relates to the United States militarily and national security. Has nothing to do with whether they have legitimate claim on the nation of Israel. Anyway, that's my 2 cents.
Hey, we'll let you keep going as long as you want. Joshua and I purposely try to find people that's smarter than we are to get on and talk about this stuff.
I make no claims to be smarter than anybody else. Believe you me. Believe you me.
But yeah, I think you guys hit it right on. I think that, and when you go back, rapture theology kind of first began really in like the 1830s. I think it was a guy named John Darby kind of came up with this, and he even said of rapture theology, he said it was just a good idea that kind of popped in my head one day, and he ran with it. And it's really kind of taken root. But I think it points to something that specifically in American religion that we look to a lot, which is, Joshua, you kind of mentioned it, is fear. There's a, and I'm not saying it should be that way, but when you go back and I think you study a lot of American religion as a whole, fear seems to be a motivating factor for a lot of it. Fear of the unknown, fear of punishment, fear of negative consequences. And when you have something like this that kind of roots itself in maybe making people a little uneasy, it's fascinating almost to me. I don't know if that's the right word, but to me, it's almost fascinating how much this takes hold in people and really large religious groups as a whole, and it just kind of gets run with. So I think that's interesting.
I heard this quote the other day.
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
You're fine. I heard this quote the other day that I don't know if it's an apocryphal quote being attributed to this person. I don't remember if it was supposedly attributed to Martin Luther or John Calvin. I think it was Luther. Said he was asked, what would you do if you knew Jesus was coming back tomorrow? And Luther said, I would plant a tree, implying, there's the possibility that he's coming back tomorrow, but there's also the possibility that he's not coming back for however long. And what do you do in the meantime? Well, you live according to the gospel call, and you live according to righteousness, regardless of when he comes.
I was going to say something. I'll say this in a minute. Hold that thought, what I was going to say for a moment. There is a book that was written relatively recently by a denominational preacher that I reviewed, by the way, for Stone Campbell Journal about the end times. And even though this guy is way off base concerning inspiration and inerrancy of Scripture, he denies both. He does deny what he was brought up in a charismatic denomination where they were emphasizing end times, rapture, beast, all of that. He coined a phrase, which this guy is good about coining phrases, and this one he just nailed it. If you know anything about United States history, you know that Dwight D. Eisenhower coined the term the military-industrial complex. You're familiar with that, I'm sure. Well, this guy that wrote this book called what he'd been grown up in the end times industrial complex, referring to the books, magazines, videos. A whole industry has been built around this, and they have to keep it going constantly, constantly, constantly. So that's one thing. Another thing, when I was in high school, I was about to say, I think it was my junior year of high school. My friends were a lot like the guys on The Big Bang Theory. Whenever I see that show, I don't make a habit of watching it, but whenever I have seen snippets of it, I'm thinking, okay, this is like a video taken in when I was growing up. My circle of friends were nerds, and I was more of a nerd myself, shock of shocks. But still, the fact is, one of my friends said, you've got to listen to this album that he had just bought, a heavy metal. And this is heavy metal before hair bands. This is not hair band. This is the true show enough heavy metal. He said, you're a preacher's son. You'll be interested in this. And he pulled out the album. It was Iron Maiden, Number of the Beast. If you've ever seen the cover online, or if you've seen it actually in person, you know what I'm referring to. It's this big cartoon-like depiction of a giant beast terrorizing a town, or the earth, I guess. He said, you got to listen to the opening lines of this, man. It's just great. He puts the needle on the record, and this deep voice, this ominous voice, is reading from Revelation 13. And he says, the number of the beast is the number of the man, 666. And all of a sudden, the guitar kicks in. He said, man, isn't that cool? And I'm standing there thinking, okay. Yeah, whatever. But it feeds into this idea that I just mentioned a little bit ago about the Hollywood-esque panoramic picture, that we're so enthralled by the imagery, we're so enthralled by the context of Revelation, or what supposedly the context, that we miss the big picture. We miss chapter 1, where John clearly states what he's talking about, and clearly states when it was going to be fulfilled. And it ties that in with Old Testament prophecies concerning the return of Israel from Babylonian captivity back to their homeland. Nehemiah 7:73 is an overlooked verse in all of this discussion. I remember when I was a graduate student back in 1900 and none of business, under Rex Turner Sr., who was one of the founders of Faulkner University. I was at what is now Amridge University doing my master's work. He pointed out that Nehemiah 7:73 is key, because in that verse, it says that all Israel were in their cities. All Israel, meaning all 12 tribes, they had returned. Other passages from Nehemiah and Ezra both indicate that this was fulfilled, that they have returned, fulfilling what had been prophesied in Ezekiel and other places. So when people take those prophecies about the return of Israel and apply it to 1948 and 1967 and things of present vintage, it's a gross abuse of Scripture, in my estimation.
Sure. We'll kind of, that kind of leads us into the actual video, right? So for those of you that have listened or watched it before, it's one of those nice little creepy voices about end times prophecy and all the Old Testament. The first one that he quotes is that the Bible says that Israel would once again become a nation, and this happened in 1948. Which ironically, this video he says that the third one's going to shock you the most, and he runs through 1 and 2 very quickly, and then spends just as little time on number 3, which I think is interesting. But anyway, so Israel's going to become a new nation. He's going to become a nation once again. This happened in 1948. So Joshua, Dr. Hester, whoever wants to go for that one, I'm all about some history lessons here.
Well, the intertestamental period is incredibly overlooked in, I think, religious circles, particularly in Protestantism. Maybe our Catholic friends may pay a little more attention to that, because their Bibles have the Apocrypha and some pseudepigraphy in it, depending on which Bible they use. But, that's, first of all, that's not entirely true, because in the intertestamental period, when they do come back from Babylonian captivity, and they do kind of go through different changes between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies and overturning, there's a short period of time where the Roman government first steps in and says, we will help you overthrow, I believe it's the Seleucids at the time. We will help you do that. We will establish a priest and a king, and we will step back and we'll just kind of be your allies. And if everybody wants to know how did Rome get involved, that's how they got involved. And so there was a short period of time where Israel had its own borders, had its own king, had its own high priest, and were working in that regard long before the 1900s. Now, to be fair, it was a short period of time, and then Rome was like, no, we would actually like to be in charge. And so they came in, and we have the context of the New Testament. But so if that's the case, the Bible does prophesy Israel being a nation again. And I think, too, we have to ask, from a New Testament perspective, what is the nation of Israel? And that kind of opens a whole nother can of worms. Maybe we can visit later. But I was telling Nathan, Dr. Hester, I preached on this yesterday morning, that Hebrews chapter 2, I believe it's verse 12, that his, being Jesus, concern is for Abraham's descendants. In Galatians chapter 3, verse 26 through 29, says that if you've been baptized into Christ, you are a descendant of Abraham. You're a child, you're an heir according to the promise. So we have some definitions to kind of get through, but the prophecy of Israel becoming a nation, well, technically that did happen a long time ago. Dr. Hester, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think you're right on. The intertestamental period is something that I've been fascinated with ever since I had Rex Turner, referring to him again, for that very subject. And I have his notes. You can purchase them online through Amazon, and it's excellent notes. And he heavily relied on Daniel. Daniel prophesied concerning the intertestamental period, and also on First and Second Maccabees, which historically speaking, Maccabees is a good reference tool. It's not inspired of God, in my opinion, but still, it's very, very helpful to understand that entire period. There was a period of time, I'd even go back further before Rome, that there was a period of time where actually Israel had in essence, the kingdom that was at its peak. They covered the landmass that would almost equal that in as far as just landmass is concerned. Especially when Judas Maccabeus and his brothers, revolted against Antiochus IV Epiphanes and all of his hordes. They restored much back that needed to be restored. Mel Gibson, before he fell out of favor because of all of his indiscretions, was going to make a big screen movie about Judas Maccabeus. And I think it would have been on the order of Braveheart, even beyond it, because if you know anything about Judas Maccabeus, the Hammer was his nickname. That guy militarily was unstoppable. I mean, he defeated foes or armies much bigger than him. I understood at one time Israel used his tactics as something that they studied for their own military tactics. And you don't mess with the Israeli army and their special forces. Those guys are top notch, and their intelligence services are right up there, if not the top flight service in the world. But still, when you're talking about Israel being back to what they once were, they were in every aspect except the king and the priest. Of course, that was set up for Jesus Christ to come and be both those through the order of Melchizedek. But yet, people want to put all that in the future when it's clearly been fulfilled. And when you're talking about the nation of Israel, the state of Israel really is what it's called, the state of Israel. They're a very important strategic ally, perhaps the most important strategic ally that the United States has had, since the 1960s at least, when they really came to their own in 67 war. I mean, they fought off how many nations at once in 67? That was impressive in and of itself. And all the things they've done since militarily have been impressive. But the fact remains, it's not anywhere near like it was in its peak during the reign of the kings, and then also during the intertestamental period. So all of that we're talking about are things, the prophecies are things that have already been fulfilled, and is made very clear that it has been fulfilled.
Sure. So that you kind of mentioned it, Dr. Hester. So we'll go ahead and hit on this too, because the second claim in this video is that one of the prophecies that was fulfilled was that Israel would regain control of Jerusalem, which happened in the Six-Day War in 1967. Because again, not I wasn't we've been what's the word? We've been kind of beating around the bush about ages. I can confidently say I was not around for the Six Day War of 1967.
I was 2 when that happened, by the way. I might add. That gives you an idea how old I am.
But talk about that if you would for just a minute.
Yeah, Jerusalem. I mean, yes, they conquered it in '67. They took it. How long do they hold it? Not long. The UN stepped in and said, no, you can't have the whole city. It's got to be split up. And what do we see now? We see Jerusalem as a divided city. I mean, even when you're talking about the birthplace of Jesus, how many religious groups lay claim to that spot? Several. Talk to anybody who served there as a missionary. They can tell you exactly what's going on. The very temple site is controlled by the Islamic people because they have the dome of the rock sitting there, the gold dome, that's Islamic. So this guy claims that about Jerusalem in '67. He conveniently overlooks all the years since. Jerusalem has not been claimed and not been controlled by the Israeli government by any means, even though, the former president, the orange-haired former president, moved the capital. You see what I did there? He moved the capital from Tel Aviv, or had to move it from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem because nobody else has done it. I'm the only one that told them to do it. They did it. But I digress. Still, Jerusalem is the capital of Israel, but for how long? I mean, it's just it's an ever-changing situation in the Middle East at best. And now when you've got Hamas that's attacked and the threat of other terrorist groups attacking Israel, it's a powder keg. It always has been to one extent or another, but more so now than I can remember. I mean, even going back, to the 70s, when I remember the 1973 war that lasted just a short period of time. I mean, Israel, they responded to the attacks from Egypt, the attack from Jordan, and beat it back easily. So, it's always been that way. And for geopolitical and strategic purposes, we've got to support them. I mean, I don't think there's any doubt in my mind that we must support them. But on the religious side, they can't lay a claim to it.
Yeah. I think, too, there's an issue with that, talking about regaining control of Jerusalem. To what degree? Are we only talking politically, or are we talking politically and religiously? So we, a few years ago, we had an opportunity here in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, to study with a couple that claimed to be Messianic Jews. And they were talking about how, and I've heard this, I don't know if it's true or not, but there's plans to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. And my question to them was, okay, if you rebuild the temple, and even if you have a sacrificial system, who's going to offer the sacrifice? Because all the records were destroyed in AD 70 when the temple was destroyed. How are you going to know who's a Levite? How are you going to know who's of the line of Aaron? It's going to be virtually impossible. I mean, 23andMe can't even tell you. So I'm just saying, like, to what degree are we going to control Jerusalem to have that?
And on top of that, if you're saying they're going to reestablish the Levitical priesthood, the obvious problem, as you pointed out, is identifying who could do that. But also the second problem, besides the sacrifices, you've got all the other regulations of the Old Testament, of the Mosaic Law. Are you going to start stoning people who violate the Sabbath? Are you going to start killing people who violate certain commands? I mean, you see how much of a political nightmare that would be for the government of Israel, much less the people. And you've got on top of that the terrorist groups, which, in my opinion, they will never be completely eradicated as long as people are people. There's going to be evil people that are going to try to have their way or no way. And from what little I understand about the situation, the terrorist groups, especially Hamas, have this complicated, extensive literally underground tunnel system. I mean, it's akin to what I would think of when I think of the Vietnam War, with the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong having the tunnel system where they were able to avoid a destruction by the American forces. In a similar sense, you've got that in Israel with the situation with their enemies. So aside from the obvious issues with reestablishing the temple. You've got all the geopolitical problems, all of the personality issues that are going to clash, and all the larger major powers having a say in the situation, where it's Russia, Iran, China, the United States. Uh, I don't see how that could happen, honestly. Aside from the religious reasons, I don't see how practically it could take place. There's just too many problems with that.
Yeah. So this last point that he makes in the video, and we're gonna I'm gonna kind of attach some things onto this. I think, not in a trying to force the video to say something it doesn't, but the third big point that he makes when he talks about the end times and prophecy being fulfilled, is about how Israel is going to be attacked by all nations and be at odds and at wars with other people, and it leads into a little bit and alludes to a little bit some of the words that a lot of times we like to pull from the New Testament, not necessarily just Old Testament prophecy being fulfilled, but you've got passages like Luke 21 and Matthew 24 and Mark 13. And we like to take some of these passages, and Joshua, you kind of mentioned I think the debate amongst, if there is a debate, would be amongst whether or not these signs were for the end of time or were they referencing the destruction of the temple in AD 70. And so I guess, what do you make of this idea of Israel being attacked by other nations? And I guess it kind of culminates itself in the question of why is with the recorded history of Israel being at odds the way that it has been, right? Being Dr. Hester, you said the powder keg that it is. What makes this time different from all the other times, right? If this is the end times thing that we're focusing at, why? I don't know if it goes back to that why are we so obsessed with it type mentality, but what makes this time different? What are we seeing different that maybe everybody wants to really cling on to it at this moment in time?
I think in part it's because you've got an entire generation of people that have not witnessed anything like this. I mean, it's been, let's see, going all the way back to 1973. We have not seen anything on this scale since 73. Now, we've seen forays into Israel by different terrorist groups. We've seen Israel go into southern Lebanon in the early 80s that led to the bombing in Beirut of the barracks that killed over 260 Marines. That was my freshman year of college when that happened. But we haven't seen any major attacks by nations around Israel, much less terrorist groups around Israel. So that's in part what's fueling this, because they haven't seen this. Oh, this must be, and they forget or they don't know that this has happened before. And it's happened on almost as big of a scale as this. Now, in 73, the difference is you've got nations attacking Israel, not terrorist groups from almost the inside of the nation, which in my estimation makes this different. You don't have Egypt threatening from the west. You don't have Jordan threatening from the east. You've got a possibility of Syria coming in from the north. Lebanon's always been Lebanon. Lebanon's like a go-to for all the spy groups in the world. That's another story for another time. But still, you've got all these different variables that people have not seen in their lifetime. And I think that's what makes this attractive to people who are not that familiar with the backstory of intertestamental period, like Joshua mentioned a little while ago, and all of these other things we've been discussing.
Yeah. So for me, I think the reason it's on everybody's mind and why people are paying more attention to it, supposedly, if we're going to give a scale, has a lot to do with the way the world has changed in getting information into the hands of people. You get on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, like where we pulled this video from, and something about the way information is being put out is like, if I have a camera and I have a strong enough voice, then you don't have to fact check, or you don't have to do the historical thing, or you don't have to get in the Word of God and see contextually what it has to say. You just heard some really good sounding guy with some fun graphics, and therefore it must be true. And now Dr. Hester's right. We have a generation that's not seen anything to this scale, but we also have a generation who is the first to see it when it happens.
Right.
Long gone are the days of Walter Cronkite bringing the evening news and talking about it for a minute or two and then moving on to the next story. you have it there all the time, and you cannot get away from it. And so people then are just naturally curious, I think.
I agree. I agree with that because, you've got a situation, like you say, if you got a loud enough voice and you've got access to technology, you can make any assertion you want. But, our second president, John Adams, once famously said, facts are stubborn things. And no matter how much you yell, no matter how much you speak, no matter how much you claim, the fact is, facts are going to get in the way because facts are what they are.
Mm-hmm.
And when you talk about biblical matters, that's especially true.
Right.
Sure. I think it's Ben Shapiro kind of coined the phrase "facts don't care about your feelings," and he uses that more times, somewhat abrasively, but it's true, right? We as a youth minister, we used to tell our youth group kids all the time, if you say something with it's always framed in the context of knowing what you're talking about, because chances are you've got friends that they're going to say something and they're going to sound really, really confident when they say it. And the more confident you are when you say something, the more likely people are to believe you. And so knowing what you're talking about is a massive part of this conversation, really any conversation you have, right? But especially a conversation in the midst of this, because right now I think you guys both hit it really spot on. You've got so many people saying so many things, and everybody's saying it so confidently. And when you are living in I think Joshua and I kind of went back and forth on this one time, in a postmodern world, right, where there doesn't have to be truth. Like we know truth exists, but we kind of live in a culture where it might not exist for whatever reason, and so sifting through what truth is and what facts are, and who's saying the correct things the most confidently becomes, I'm not gonna say for the first time, but becomes a real challenge to figure out, okay, what exactly am I listening to, and who exactly am I listening to, and why are people saying the things that they're saying. I think we've I don't know why. I feel like we've stopped asking why. I think we just kind of want to take everybody at their word now. But I think why is a really important word that maybe isn't used as much as it should be.
Absolutely. And, Matthew 24, you brought that up. In my estimation, the key to understanding Matthew 24 is around verse 36, I believe, where he says, this generation shall not pass to all these things be fulfilled. All these things being what he's just talked about, all these things that would take place. One of my least favorite songs of all time that is sung in worship is Jesus is Coming Soon. The first stanza and the third stanza I don't have a problem with. The second stanza I've got a big problem with, because it takes the signs of Matthew 24 and applies at the end of time. R.E. Winsett, who wrote that song, is famous, or infamous, I might add, for doing that. He added the fourth stanza to Living by Faith, this, the Lord will return to this earth some sweet day. That was written by R.E. Winsett, and it was corrected in Songs of the Church, I believe, and that verse was taken out. But that said, it's this idea that we can know from the signs, Matthew 24 signs, that Jesus is coming soon. Well, another reason why I don't like that song is I can't stand the musical notation of that song. But that's another issue for another discussion for another time. Still, the fact is, people want to take signs and apply it. There's a song that came out in the late 60s, signs, everywhere there's signs. Well, that seems to be the case with people in the end time. Y'all are too young to remember that song. But anyway, still, the fact is, people want to go by the grandeur, the spectacle, all this, just seems so similar to what we're going through, and they forget, or they ignore, or they don't know about all that has happened in the past, that has never taken shape, that has been predicted. And that's what I keep on coming back to. Sam Neill, the actor, being the Beast. Again, I can't watch Jurassic Park because of that. Look at the back of his neck. He's got 666, and you're trusting him to go against the dinosaurs? Come on, man. No. But anyway, that's my take on it.
There you go. No, I'm with you. Jesus Coming Soon is such an upbeat, happy song to be singing about death and destruction. But
true. It's like,
Well, I'll add to Dr. Hester's comments here with as far as like exegesis and hermeneutics. One thing that I find people like the three of us sitting here preach and study the Bible and have read helpful books to help us do that and have education that will help us do that. For those who don't, sometimes we forget that the subtitles are not inspired. And
right.
we forget that the chapter and verse divisions are also not inspired. And rather than sit down with a book and read it from cover to cover and asking the contextual questions, we turn to a particular verse or couple of verses, and we don't read before or after. So, Nathan, you were asking me the other day about Luke 21, particularly verse 25 through 28. But if you go back to verse 20, it says, "But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies," right
Sure.
there, we're talking very clearly about something that is going to happen within, call it from our perspective, the near future. And we forget that, I think, sometimes. We forget to read contextually. And that's something we're really big on in this podcast, is helping our listeners try to read contextually.
Yeah.
Sure.
And that's a good, very, very good point. There's a lot of good things, as you well know, that chapters and verses have done.
Sure.
Those divisions, even though they're made much, much, much later than the first century, they help us to remember. I mean, when I think of the love chapter of the New Testament, I go to 1 Corinthians 13. When I think of a chapter concerning hope and what the Holy Spirit brings in the life of a Christian, Romans 8. When I think of baptism, the purpose of baptism, I go to Romans 6. Because I remember, because of those mnemonic devices, verses and chapters, and for the most part, they do a good job. In some points, they miss it completely.
Sure.
But the flip side of that, as you've well pointed out, is overlooking the larger context. When you see the word therefore, you see what it's there for. And the same thing with wherefore. You've got to make sure you understand the total context. One other issue, another side point about songs, besides Jesus is coming soon, there's other songs that I just don't really care for because of the musical notation. This may be anathema to you two guys. I do not like As the Deer Panteth. It's not that I don't like the words. The words are great. It's
Sure.
the musical notation that just like, to me, taking fingernails and scratching them against a chalkboard. It's like, no, I will sing it. But it's not that I'm enjoying the musical notation. I focus on the words. But, there's songs like that in our songbook. That's completely subjective, I realize, completely, out of context as far as the truth is concerned. But, I think we need to improve on our songs. That's just
I 100% agree with you as far as needing to improve on our songs. And given the conversation we're having now about what's going on and prophecy and things like that, I mean, how many of our songs that we sing on Sunday morning talk about things like the rapture?
Sure.
I mean, a lot.
Yes.
And
Danny J.
yeah,
a preacher friend of mine one time wrote an article entitled "Understandest Thou What Thou Singest?" I think that's a good little turn from "Understandest Thou What Thou Readest," King James Version, "Understandest Thou What Thou Singest?" Do we really understand what we're singing? My grandfather, who preached for over 40 years before he passed away my senior year of high school, he used to say, if you can't preach what you sing, don't sing it. But then the next breath he'd say, you can easily go overboard with that if you're not careful.
Mm.
I think the editor of the songbook, Sacred Selections of the Church, was over the top in how he edited those songs. I used to call it, by the way, Scared Selections of the Church when I was a kid. But still, that's just me. But you're right, though. In our songs, are we promoting a view of the end of time and the final judgment, which is at odds with what the Bible actually says? And that's something we've got to pay careful attention to.
Sure.
Just like, another song which is not about the end of time, but another song that sometimes is sung, The Criminal on the Cross. The criminal on the cross is taking the thief on the cross and putting it as an example of our salvation today, and it's not.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got to be careful. It could sound great to our ears. It could be a peppy, uplifting, lively song and teach error. And we've got to be careful about that. we can't be so caught up in looking for error that we miss the forest for the trees. But some things are so obvious, like the second stanza of Jesus is coming soon,
Right.
that you can't overlook it.
Gotcha. Well, so that kind of leads us into this last little thing I want to talk about as we kind of wrap up. We're getting close on time, but I want us to because it kind of in a topic that we're discussing where um, I think sometimes we forget, and I told Joshua I was blessed to be part of a panel discussion where we kind of talked about this, and one of the points that I made was I think we forget sometimes that. And this is not us versus them mentality, but I think the majority of people that talk about something like this, like what we're talking about, we have to remember that most of the time, not all the time, but most of the time, people are just regurgitating what they've been told. And so I guess my question becomes, in your opinion or estimation, what should be the Christian response, not just to what's happening in the Middle East, but how we have those conversations, what we take from living through a time like this, and what do we pull from it? What do we learn from it? What should be our approach to everything that's happening?
In my opinion, we've got to demonstrate humility, as we do in everything, but demonstrate humility in discussing these matters with people, especially who are not Christians, who honestly don't know many things about what the text really says. I think we lead them kindly and lovingly to what the text actually says. Concerning Revelation, for example, whenever I have a discussion about Revelation with someone, and whenever I teach the class on it, I will go straight to chapter 1, first 9 verses, and I will point out all the basics of that section, that the introductory opening section of the book. And 9 times out of 10, people are not aware that John lays it out in the first 9 verses as far as the scope of the book is concerned. And when they see that, a lot of times the light bulb will go off and they'll think, maybe I've not been looking at this correctly. And then that opens the door for you to be able to discuss about the signs and what they refer to in Revelation 20 and what it's talking about. What it's not talking about is as important as what it is talking about. The things that are not mentioned in Revelation 21 through 8, most people that advocate this view that we're discussing are not aware that Jerusalem's not in Revelation 20. Christ on earth is not in Revelation 20. We are not mentioned in Revelation 20. And the people that are mentioned as reigning with Christ are those who have been martyred, who's been beheaded for the cause of Christ. They shall reign with Christ for 1,000 years, whatever the 1,000 years refers to. But it's definitely not an earthly reign. So what we've got to do is have the proper attitude and try to lead people into what the Bible actually says and let them see for themselves and let them come to an understanding themselves of what the scriptures actually say. That's one advantage that I have here at a place like Faulkner, where I've been teaching for several years. I come in contact in my classes with people, not just who are members of the church, but who are not, who assume that they know what they know, and when they see what the text actually says, I see that light bulb effect and where it just hits them.
Yeah.
This is what the Bible really says and not just what I've been taught all my life. So I think that's very important.
Yeah, I've had the same experience getting to teach biblical worldview too at Faulkner. Do that online, and I tell my students in sort of the last. It's an 8-week class that I teach, and I tell them in the last week of that class, right before the final exam. You may. I hope you've learned something in this class. I hope you can take something with you. I hope you learn how to think Christianly about things and look at the world through the lens of the Bible. But if you take nothing else, take this. And I didn't come up with this. I stole it from another preacher. But he said, the goal of the Christian life is not to get to heaven. The goal of the Christian life is for Christ-likeness now. If you have Christ-likeness now, heaven will be there. And I really think that if we would preach that more in our pulpits, and if we would stop worrying so much about what is to come, because what's to come has been promised. You're not going to get out of the judgment day. You're not going to get out of heaven and hell. You're not going to get out of Christ coming back. That's in concrete. It's set in stone. It's going to happen. The question for us is, how do we live today? in light of that. It was like we said earlier, he could come back today. He could come back 10,000 years from now. I don't know. And the way I read scripture is neither does he. Perhaps there's debate to be had there with some textual issues, but, how do you live today? What are you doing today to prepare you for then? I want to make it clear to our listeners that with this conversation, we're not saying at all that our hearts don't break for those who have been impacted by the turmoil over there on either side
Absolutely.
of the fight. We hate the loss of innocent life and hope that peace is found. But as far as things that are happening over there, translating to the pages of Scripture, insofar as you can tell the end, um, if you're living for Christ today, when the end comes, shouldn't matter.
I absolutely agree. And again, I emphasize to our listeners as well that I personally am 100% behind Israel's right to exist as a nation, behind Israel defending itself from outside attacks. And I believe that, again, as I've mentioned before, Israel is the most important ally that we have in the Middle East, bar none. And I too grieve over the people who have been affected, who've been killed, whose families have been affected dramatically by this. And I echo everything that you said. And all I would say in conclusion is just remember Sam Neill is the beast. Just joking, just joking. I just can't watch the guy. I just can't. I'm seeing Omen final conflict up there, but that's another
Yeah.
story.
No, I think it's really important when you start talking, having conversations like this. I do think that it's there's a big temptation to want to boil this down to make it a political issue or a theological issue, and I think that we forget that it's really a human issue. Everything that goes on, everything that's happening affects human beings, and human beings whose value in the eyes of our God are not any more or less significant than yours or mine. And I think that sometimes we miss that. But I would say that, as we kind of always do, when you approach this particular topic, I think that approaching it as unbiased as possible is probably a good start, right? You can't go looking. I had a preacher say that if you go looking to the Bible to prove yourself right, you'll often do it. You can make it say whatever you want, and so approaching it, just from a blank slate almost, I think is got to be key. But the why we talk about it and the how we talk about it are just as important as the what we talk about too. So.
Right.
But anyway, but guys, that's all I've got for you, Joshua, Dr. Hester. If you guys have anything else, by all means, shoot fire.
I think that's a
I'm
good place.
fine. I've got to get off here in a minute because I got to eat a late lunch because I've got a faculty meeting in front of me.
Well,
And, that's anyway, I'm looking forward to the faculty meeting. For everybody that's listening to this, I'm looking forward very much to the faculty meeting.
there you go. So we won't take any more of your time, Dr. Hester. We appreciate you so much being on and giving us some of your time today. If you are on the fence, undecided about where you want to go to college, I'm sure Dr. Hester would love for you to consider Faulkner University.
We'd love to have your children, and your adults to come to be our students. We have degrees in many different areas, both undergraduate and graduate degrees. And so, whatever you're interested in studying, I'm sure we've got a major for you, and we hope that you'll consider us.
Absolutely. As always, guys, if you have any other questions, comments, please let us know. We're not hard to reach. You can find us pretty easily if you try just a little bit. But until next time, thanks.